Hey coaches, today we're going to be talking about the coaching agreement. A coaching agreement is the second core competency from the International Coach Federation, the first thing that's really measured by the International Coach Federation for assessment purposes, and more importantly, it is the foundation of any coaching relationship and any coaching session. The competency of building and establishing a coach agreement, a coach-client agreement, therefore, is something that needs to be demonstrated every single session, not just because we want to do well on a test or something like that, but rather we want to make sure that our client and the coach, ourselves as coaches, we have an understanding and a partnership around where things are going with the coaching. So in order to make the most of the time, let's say you have a 30-minute session, 45-minute session, 60-minute session or more, there are certain things that the ICF wants to see a coach explore to make sure the time is being filled correctly, to make sure the direction of the conversation is going the direction that the client really wants. So right now we're going to look at the coaching agreement in terms of an individual session. We're going to have other videos on a coaching agreement for the overall coaching relationship, but other things also related to how do you do agenda setting or setting up an agreement for an individual session or longer-term relationship. Let's first look at the markers of success. And every time I say markers of success, it's always referring to the PCC markers from the International Coach Federation, which are kind of the standard expectations set by the ICF and also a great way of understanding what parts of a competency, in this case, establishing a coaching agreement, what parts of a competency need to be explored in a coaching session. There's 5 markers of success for setting up an agreement for a session. Those 5 things are subject. Do we know what we're even talking about? What's the topic of today's conversation? What do you want to focus on with our time today? This is a really basic question. We'll toss up some questions onto the slide here for you to take a look at. A coach can ask questions like, it could actually be the first thing you say in a way, how would you like us to start today? And that would lead probably to the agenda for today, the topic or subject. After checking in maybe on an accountability piece from the last session, the coach could ask, so based on what you experienced and what you learned from last week's action, what would you like to focus on for today, this week? So you can kind of segue like that. Or if there was a lack of follow through with an accountability piece, based on what happened this past week with you intending on doing blank action and it didn't go as you planned, is that what you'd like us to focus on with our coaching session today? Or would you like to look at something else? So it could be a carryover from an accountability piece from the last session, checking in on the action and seeing if we can do a better job with planning out follow through for an action step. There's a lot of different ways to roll into setting the agenda. Every once in a while, you might have coaches that just jump right into the agenda setting. Other coaches do. Most coaches, I'd say, often like to start the conversation off with some chit-chat, some catching up, building rapport. But in many ways, the coaching doesn't really start, or at least not with clear direction, until the coach asks, what would you like us to focus on with our time today? So that's marker number 1, subject. Marker number 2, result. It's the measurable outcome, the target we are aiming for with this coaching session. And it's also got very similar language to subject. So for me, it took like 2 years for me to really get and hear it and like fully understand and embrace. Like, what is the difference between asking, what would you like to talk about today? And what would you like to take away from our conversation today? Now, they sound very similar, but when asked, I think more correctly or more in line with a natural conversation, it makes sense the distinction. So if I ask you as my client, what would you like to talk about today? And you were to say, I've got a meeting with my manager tomorrow and I really want to be very well prepared because there's no set agenda. Okay, great. That's subject. I would ask the question oftentimes, if we were to talk about your meeting with your manager for the next 30 minutes, what do you want to take away from our conversation to help? What's a practical takeaway you want to walk away with so that you feel prepared for tomorrow? Or if we spent 45 minutes on this topic of prepping for the meeting tomorrow, what would make it worth it? You're essentially saying, if we spend so much time on this topic, why? Like, what are you after? How would you, if you were to give me the expectations for the test that we need to be studying for, how will I know that we're ready to take the test by the end of the session? We have some measurable way of knowing that we're progressing the direction the client wants to progress. So that's number 2, some sort of measurable result, a target to aim for. Number 3, potential for transformation. The change that the individual wants to see in their lives. The significance of this session and the topic. I like to camp out a little bit on that significance. One of my favorite things to bring up in training is if you have a person that's a very busy professional, it's hard for them to squeeze in a 30-minute or 45-minute session, a 1-hour session into their schedule. And they're making that time. It's even if someone else, their company's paying for the coaching, they are making that sacrifice of time to be there on the call or in person with their coach. Why on earth are they bringing this topic up? Like, why? If they could bring anything else up, they could. They can. But why this? Like, that's a really good question to ask. What makes this topic so significant to you? What is so important about seeing this conversation with your manager tomorrow go very well? Also, though, we don't only want to know why this is top of mind and why it's important, but what difference in themselves the client would like to see, what change they want to have in their lives. This goes beyond the idea of just measurable result because it gets at the who, the being of the client, the personhood, their values, their expectations, the way they see themselves. We want to make sure that we're coaching that part of the agenda, not just a meeting. It's oftentimes not the meeting tomorrow with the manager. It's oftentimes not the interview with the recruiter. It's often not. It's not the thing that they're bringing to the session that's really at the root of what their concern is. Instead, what makes this meeting with their manager top of mind is because that there's not a clear agenda. And last time they had a meeting where there's not a clear agenda, this happened. And they want to learn how to do better with that kind of scenario. Oh, that's a change. That's a transformation. That's some real meat or significance, meaning to a session. We want to make sure to flesh some of that out. Potential for transformation. Number 4, things to address, areas to address, like subtopics. If you think about some of the biggest challenges, some of the biggest problems, some of the biggest opportunities you've ever experienced in your life, if you were to try to have one conversation in preparation for that thing, thered be a lot of pieces to it. It's not just meeting with the manager. It's not just preparing to fire a direct report. It's applying for a new position. There are many, many subtopics that are part of each of those potential agendas. Subtopics related to what they've experienced in the past, maybe. Subtopics about their fears and hopes for the future. Subtopics of trying to figure out what they really even feel, what their expectations are right now, how they see themselves. All these things are like possibilities that we could put onto the table. And if a coach isn't careful, the coach will make the decision about what possible subtopic needs to be the focus of the conversation because they don't ask, hey, if we talk about meeting with your manager tomorrow, what are some of the things that we should make sure to cover with this time so we get to the root issues? What do you most want to cover in terms of your preparation for the meeting? If you think about what makes a good conversation or good support to help you prepare for something like this, what are some of the things we most need to discuss? Put the weight on the client to come up with some areas, some subtopics, so that we can narrow the scope of the conversation. Oftentimes, Coaching conversations can be really broad and abstract. And we want to do our best to try to chunk it down a little bit. A good agenda doesn't necessarily have to be very clear cut with all of these pieces, but the coach needs to have explored them so we have a sense of where the client is and where they'd like to be by the end of the conversation and what needs to be covered to get there. Finally, marker number 5 is teaming up. We want to make sure the rest of the conversation from this point carries forward towards the intended direction of the client. It's often good for the coach to ask the client how they'd like to start. After the client has explored these things, oftentimes just unfolding the session agreement is going to provide much more clarity than they may have expected at the very beginning of the exploration. You really haven't left the path, you've just identified the path, but sometimes just identify what trail this person, what path this person wants to take. They realize where they need to go. They realize the first step they need to take. They have a better understanding. So instead of the coach asking like a really super powerful question to start things off after the agenda's kind of been set, it's good for the coach to say, so what's first? Like, how should we get started? Or how should we partner to kick this conversation off? So after all these things, the subject, the result, the potential for transformation, the areas to address, all that's in place, how should we begin? That should be the transition question into the real part of the coaching session. Now, subject, result, transformation, area of improvement, and teaming up. These aren't necessarily the International Coach Federation's words for these markers of success. However, I do have these as the words because I found them to be good at summarizing what's really going on with each of these markers, and I actually prefer them in a different order. I usually explain to coaches in training to avoid starting with the result, because if we start with the measurable result, oftentimes that's going to be the more high-level, surface type of agenda. It's going to be the just the parts that are top of mind. My encouragement is to begin with the subject, then go into the potential for transformation, then the areas to address, and then the potential, like the measurable result. From that point, teaming up from there. Fancily, that spells start. So it's just a way to remember how to set the agenda. Subject, potential for transformation, areas to address, the result that we want by the end of the session, and teaming up from there. Now, there's more that we could say, and I do want to unpack some of the questions around this idea of agenda setting and the difficulties it might run into, the concerns. But I want you to spend some time thinking about these things and to take some of those questions that you've seen in the slides here and to start a coaching conversation just with those. It can just be, and you'll hear me say this a lot. I don't encourage coaches to just take a list of questions and follow them by, back to back, but feel free to do that. And just in terms of practice, take one question from each slide for START, and you'll see those here, and pick one from each and just go through them one after another and see where you land. You'll be in a much deeper place than if you just tried to navigate the original subject. I hope this is helpful. The practice, though, is very important. It might be fairly simple in terms of following these questions. There's much more to the art of setting a coach agreement for a session than just following a list of questions. So we're beginning the journey of setting up an individual coaching session. Let's next look at some other opportunities to set broader agendas or agreements over a relationship or a given period of time, as well as some of the questions and concerns around coaching agreements. Hope this is helpful. Keep coaching.